Well, hello, this is Patrick McGuire with the Elkhart County Historical Museum, and this is our first podcast with the Goshen News. So today, what we thought we'd do for a subject is give you a quick tour of our brand new exhibit, Crossroads of Elkhart County, Claiming the Land. So let's take a look. So our exhibit is split into numerous sections based on cultural groups. So when you come in, the first cultural group you see is Native Americans, where we tell the story of Miami and Potawatomi as they were living here leading up to their forced removal in the mid-18th or 19th century. So some of the things that we want to point out first, we really wanted to tie this to our local history. So we got a lot of information about Five Metals, who was the most prominent Native leader in what becomes Elkhart County. So over the years, we've heard a lot about him, but we wanted to make sure to confirm what we knew about him in the facts. So we reached out to the citizen band of Potawatomi in Oklahoma, and we found out a lot of things. First, we found out a correct spelling of his given name when he was negotiating treaties. We confirmed his actual name that he went by, which was Onaska. And a lot of the things that we already knew, the fact that he met with President Washington and President Jefferson. It was a good way to tie what was happening here in the region and really the nation, really down to a local level. Another important part of the exhibit is we list above this section the number of treaties that the Miami and Potawatomi were a part of during the 18th and 19th century. So up above us, we have a list of every single treaty that the Potawatomi and Miami were involved in. There were other groups as well that were tribute to these treaties, but we really wanted the visitor to see all the interactions that they were having with the United States government. And really, each one of those treaties, if you think about it, is acres and miles of land that they gave up. And then one of the things that was really important for us to kind of compare and talk about, bring it to a personal level, is here on the wall, we have a quote from a newspaper in Cincinnati dealing with the Miami when they were removed from Indiana in the 1840s. So we have a receipt of a ship listing. So you can see here it lists things like barrels of whiskey, ponies, linseed oil, flaxseed, apples, and right in the middle, treating them like cargo, and that's why we thought it was important to include, it lists over 225 Miami Native Americans. So we really wanted the visitors to understand that removal was a really hard part of history, and the museum has never really talked about it, so we're glad that we're able to kind of bring it to light and have it in our exhibit that now it can be discussed amongst the people in our community. So the next section in the exhibit deals with the habitation of the French. And as we go through the exhibit, each cultural group we talk about and interpret their history in the region. But really, what's interesting about this exhibit is we really try to explain the interactions between all these groups. So in this section, the French section, it really deals with how, as the French come into this area, how the native groups welcome them in or don't welcome them in, and the kind of efforts that the French were doing to take over this land and claim them from themselves. So the most important kind of, for our area that they talk about is fur trading. So we have some reproduction trade silver here that isn't from the time period, but is replicas of things that have been found in our region that the French would bring to the native groups, and then they would trade with animal furs and a number of different other things. So, and throughout this section, you can see a variety of things that the French introduced to these native cultures and what the native people gave to the French in this back and forth. So this was based solely on economic terms. The other main thing that the French did at this time was try to convert native populations to Christianity. So we have a section about missionary work, and we talk about how Jesuit missionaries traversed this entire region, which becomes what today is the Midwest, and set up missions and try to work. And it was interesting from the native groups that we were working with, the reactions. They told us that as missionaries would come into these native areas, some would think that this was a good economic decision, so they decided to convert for trade relations. Some saw this as a conversation where the missionaries would try to spread the faith, and the native groups would say, great, and then this is what we believed, and that caused a disconnect. So it was an interesting kind of relationship to try to understand. And this section of the exhibit really talks about how the French really integrated themselves into the native cultures, which other groups in this exhibit don't necessarily do, and it's a different type of philosophy, which you see throughout the exhibit. Okay, the next section is the British section. The British really controlled politically this area for a very short period of time, and it was actually fairly controversial, or there was a lot of conflict going on. They entered this area after the French and Indian War, so they declared victory. And when they entered this region and interacted with native groups, they treated them as a conquered people. And the British really thought that the native people could not live without the British people. And this is when we first see a number of uprisings led by a number of native groups in this region specifically. And the British have to try to figure out how they're going to deal with it. And the one quote that we included in this exhibit, which we think is really powerful for the story that we're trying to tell, is this quote up here by Geoffrey Amherst, who was in charge of this region militarily for the British. And he thinks that the best way to put down these uprisings is to resort to biological and germ warfare by taking blankets that people with smallpox had been using and trading them specifically to native groups to hopefully spread disease. So it kind of shows you the mindset of at least one British leader. The British really was a disaster here. Not only were they trying to fight native groups, but they were trying to fight their own people that were in the British colonies and later become the United States, moving westward. So they're trying to contain the colonists while also trying to deal with all these uprisings. So they didn't really control this area very long. It was only a period of about 20 years. In the section that talks about the Americans taking over this area before it becomes Indiana and Elkhart County. So this is territory, part of the Northwest Territories, and then later becomes the Indiana Territory before becoming a state. So in this area, once again, we see a new group moving west to encounter the native groups that are here and how that worked. So some of the particular things in this exhibit, we have this map here which really lays out all the treaties that were negotiated in what becomes the state of Indiana. So we can point to the specific treaties that the land that becomes Elkhart County was a part of. So we have the Treaty of Chicago and the Treaty of Mississinewa, both in the 1820s. But prior to that, one of the things bringing history down on the local level, and what I think this exhibit does really well is it calls back to different sections, particularly the native section. So we think we have a good description of the attack and destruction of Five Meadows Village. So Five Meadows was a Potawatomi leader that lived here. And then during the War of 1812 and then in 1813, his village was attacked by United States soldiers and destroyed on two separate occasions. So we have a panel that talks about that, as well as we have a direct quote from Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson to William Henry Harrison that outlaying his report about how he decided to handle Five Meadows Village during the second attack. And it's important because of who those two people were. At this time, they were military leaders, but William Henry Harrison goes on to become President of the United States. Richard Mentor Johnson actually goes on to become Vice President. So we have two kind of big, prominent historical figures later on in their careers talking about this specific area. So we really wanted to include that.